Also have some new breaking news as the jury has just come to a unanimous decision in the Daniel Penny case. And NBC's Antonia Hilton is outside the courthouse for us. MSNBC legal correspondent Lisa Rubin is here with us. Antonia, walk us through the verdict and where this takes us in the case.
Hey, Anna, the verdict from the jury is that Daniel Penny has been found not guilty, and that is of the second lesser charge that he was facing, which was criminally negligent homicide. This is after the events of last week. This jury, made up of an anonymous group of 7 women, 5 men, were deadlocked on the initial manslaughter charge. Prosecutors then asked the judge to dismiss that so the jury could move to considering the second lesser felony, and the jury has now come back after only about an hour of discussion with this not guilty verdict. They spent more than 23 hours in deliberations over this case that has become something of a fault line here in the New York area. And we're incredibly conscientious throughout the process. In fact, they sent numerous notes back to the judge to ask for clarifications, additional explanations, to review evidence one more time and testimony one more time. And that's really a reflection of just the difficulty, the sort of discussion and debate that's happened in this city at large. Some arguing here in New York that Daniel Penny is a hero who took necessary action that day in May of 2023. Prosecutors say that he held Jordan Neely in a chokehold for about 6 minutes, and people who have supported him said that he was protecting his fellow New Yorkers who experienced sort of unpredictable and sometimes frightening incidents on public transportation here. And then others, you may be able to hear behind me here that there's a crowd of protesters that have gathered here to support Jordan Neely. They see this as a case that is about social justice, racial justice in New York City, the lack of support for people suffering with mental health challenges, the lack of support for people who are experiencing homelessness, all of which deeply impacted Jordan Neely for many years leading up to his death. And so this is certainly going to continue to be an emotional and charged moment here in the city. In fact, our team on the inside of the courtroom says that upon hearing the verdict, people were immediately emotional. His supporters cheering and relieved, and others just absolutely devastated, immediately crying, some escorted out of the court because of their reactions, Anna.
Yeah, we are learning Jordan Neely's father is among those who were tossed out of the courtroom for yelling, we are told, according to our reporters who were inside the courtroom. Lisa, talk to us about the evidence that we saw come out during this trial that may have led to this verdict.
Well, first of all, Anna, there were more than 40 witnesses over the course of the trial, including people who experienced these events in real time, sitting on the same subway car, some of whom testified that they were indeed afraid of Jordan Neely as this episode unfolded. That may have had an impact on the jury, which was asked to assess, with respect to both of the counts that they were asked to consider, whether or not the district attorney's office had proven beyond a reasonable doubt that there was no justification for what Daniel Penny had done. So these 2 counts, manslaughter was the first count, criminally negligent homicide was the other, were presented to the jury in the alternative, meaning you could only find a guilty verdict as to one. If they had found him guilty on manslaughter, they would have never moved to the charge that they determined today. But as we know from last week, they could not reach a verdict with respect to the manslaughter count. Now, finding somebody guilty on manslaughter requires 2 things. First, you have to prove that the person was reckless. And secondly, as I just mentioned, you have to find that the district attorney failed to prove to you as a jury beyond a reasonable doubt that the person had a lack of justification for their actions. And that's where, based on the notes that the jury sent the judge here, it seemed like they were hung up. The reason that's important is because that lack of justification issue also presents in a criminally negligent homicide count. So if the jury was unable to reach a resolution amongst themselves, finding that the DA proved beyond a reasonable doubt that there was no justification for Daniel Penny's actions, they couldn't find that as to manslaughter, fairly likely they're never going to find that as to the other count. It's none surprising to me, given what we saw happen last week, particularly after a weekend's break, which is never good for prosecutors, that this jury then came to a fairly quick conclusion, given how many hours they had spent beforehand, to acquit Daniel Penny.
Right. They had just come back within the last couple of hours to begin deliberations on the second lesser charge. Again, the breaking news here, Daniel Penny found not guilty. But Lisa, we also know that Jordan Neely's family had filed, I believe, a civil suit in this case as well. Does the verdict in this case impact that?
Not necessarily. I mean, the law is rife with examples of people who are acquitted in criminal cases and yet find justice with respect to civil accountability. I think the best example of that is with respect to Ron Goldman being the man who was murdered alongside Nicole Brown Simpson. Even though O.J. Simpson was never found criminally guilty for those two murders, Fred Goldman, the father, along with his daughter, then sued O.J. Simpson civilly and won a fairly large verdict with respect to civil liability for O.J. Simpson. There are many other examples of similar disjuncture between what happens in a criminal court and what happens when respect to a wrongful death action, for example, by a family.
And so now, as this news is sinking in, Antonia, talk to us about what's happening outside the courthouse. We hear the protesters.
There are several dozen protesters here chanting outraged. The majority of the people here right outside the court are supporters of Jordan Neely, who have been talking about the need for mental health care, racial justice in New York City. I think our cameraman, Art, is going to try to swing so that you can see a little bit of what's happening here. At times, things have gotten tense this morning. Protesters have yelled at reporters here and asked us questions. I think they've been very anxious about what's happening inside. And also, at times, it's gotten so loud, in fact, that our team inside the courtroom shared with us that it became a discussion point among Daniel Penny's team and the judge. Penny's team came forward this morning before the verdict came back and raised concern that some of the remarks made by the protesters here could be interpreted as threatening to the jury, could sway their opinion in some way. The judge dismissed that, and it doesn't appear to have swayed them because the jury came back with a not guilty verdict pretty shortly after that. But it has been incredibly tense here. And again, you know, Anna, as I said before, this is a case that has become this fault line in New York. It is a case that seems to have brought together so much discussion New Yorkers are having in their daily life about public safety, about security, about the availability of health care. For some people, they see connections between other recent cases. I covered the case of a man experiencing homelessness and mental illness who stabbed 3 New Yorkers just a few weeks ago. And so all of this seems to be converging at this critical moment. And Jordan Neely's story and the heartbreak people feel over it is certainly really the heart of it, Anna.
Lisa, final thought?
You know, Anna, one of the things that came across to me is the jury was not polled here in delivering their verdict. That means nobody asked the jurors one at a time to confirm that this is their verdict. That means we didn't get to hear from the people who are on this jury. And one thing that I'm really curious about is whether or not there are people on the jury who feel like they want to speak out. Because, again, if they could not reach a unanimous verdict to find him guilty, based on their prior experiences, they may have concluded that they were never going to reach a unanimous verdict. That doesn't mean there weren't people on this jury who would have voted to find Daniel Penny guilty, and particularly given how fraught this case is, given what else is going on in the city of New York, as Antonia was just very vividly describing. I'll be curious to see if any jurors come forward and want to tell their story to folks like us.
Yeah.